And now for more insight into all these latest developments, we welcome to studio International Affairs analyst Dan Perry, former Europe and Middle East editor at the Associated Press. Dan, thank you so much for being here. We heard that report right now in terms of humanitarian aid. Before we even get to the details in the truce hostage deal, your take on the efforts right now, the optics right now, to make sure that aid is getting into Gaza as we speak. The pressure from abroad is strong and it is ongoing.
Israel's impeding of aid going into Gaza was all pain and no gain. It was both unwise and immoral, just stupid. And it's good that it's ending. So basically the conversation was for 2 or 3 months how Israel's causing famine and starvation and disease in Gaza, and thankfully, not just in fact, but it needs to be seen that this is no longer the case, and Israel is doing all it can to let the aid go in. But, you know, it's not a good look when a couple of days after the phone call between Netanyahu and Biden, the military suddenly declares that it is possible to triple the speed of checking the trucks. Well, why did it need to be that Biden had to, you know, lower the boom on Netanyahu for Israel to discover this fact? So that was unfortunate, and hopefully it's done. There really is a humanitarian disaster in Gaza, and that has obscured the bigger story, which is that Gaza remains, half of it, under the boot of terrorist mafia that Israel really does need to finish the job with. And obviously recent days' events take us to a different place with a bisection of the Gaza Strip.
We're going to unpack a bit more of that in a short while. I now want to bring into the conversation Professor Corby Michael, Senior Research Fellow at the INSS and Mizgav Institutes and the former Deputy Director General in the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs. Professor, thank you so much for your time. We're talking about a potential truce hostage deal. Time is of the essence for the hostages. A 6-week pause in fighting is on the table. At the moment, we're hearing Hamas isn't happy and is going to send its own proposal in the coming days. Your take on what we're hearing so far?
Hello, good afternoon. I'm a bit, I would say, more pessimistic in this regard. I think that the gaps are still unbridgeable, and I think that Hamas still has no incentive to make some further concessions or to be more flexible in this regard. And unfortunately, the American administration just helps Hamas in this regard. Therefore, it looks that we are closer to a crisis than closer to a breakthrough.
Dan is nodding. I want your take on who has the leverage right now. Hamas isn't happy. It's a terror organization holding hostages as we speak for more than 6 months.
They don't care about the price that Israel exacts. They don't care about the loss of life in Gaza. They welcome the loss of life in Gaza. So Israel has no leverage, basically. I think the criticism of the government has been a little bit unfair, that they're not doing enough to bring back the hostages. What can they do? Hamas will only release the hostages in exchange for an end to the war. And Israel, rightly, is hesitating before ending the war. I strongly suspect that at some point it will become clear that perhaps the war is ended without a declaration, and Hamas will remain in charge of the southern part of the Strip, and Israel will continue to attack it here and there, but there will be sort of a modus vivendi for a while. And during that interregnum, perhaps there will be a new dynamic that will change the reality currently that is, as my fellow panelists just said, Hamas has no incentive. They're being helped by the Americans in the world. All this criticism of Israel just gives Hamas more gifts with every day that passes. Why should they release the hostages from their point of view when the hostages are their life insurance policy?
Professor, your take on exactly that and what strategy Israel should be taking right now to get those hostages home as soon as possible.
I said several times before, I think that there are 3 major vectors that should be activated or realized simultaneously. The first one is to increase the pressure on Qatar, and the only player that can do it is the United States. And I think that they still they don't do enough in this regard, because Qatar has the most significant leverage over Hamas. Secondly, to increase the military pressure of Hamas, and to accelerate the preparations for a military operation in Rafah. And thirdly, an immediate replacement to Hamas on the ground in a way that will signal to the leadership of Hamas as well as to the population in Gaza that Hamas is not a valid option to the day after the war. The only valid option that I can see for a replacement for Hamas currently is a temporary provisional military administration. There is no any other option. And when we leave emptiness or vacuum, then the emptiness and the vacuum are filled by the recovering and the regrouping of Hamas. And I think that we have to provide a sort of a solution to this problem. And only when we will be able to realize all of these three vectors simultaneously, there is a higher probability for a breakthrough in the negotiation.
Dan, your thoughts?
Well, I was going to say, rarely have I found myself in such agreement with a professor until Professor Michael said that the only alternative to Hamas in the north of Gaza is a military administration. That's a valid point of view, but I think there is another alternative, which is the Palestinian Authority under a rejuvenated, revitalized, reshuffled situation. If Israel decides to make its presence in North Gaza more or less semi-permanent, it will be at loggerheads with the world for the next many years over that issue. It will face an insurrection day and night. More soldiers will be killed. I understand the reasons why one might think the PA is bad, but as I so often say whenever I comment upon the Middle East, it may be the least bad. I don't think a permanent military administration, with respect to Professor Michael, is the least bad.
But Dan, it's very clear that the sentiment within Ramallah is hugely supportive of what happened on the 7th of October. And Israeli leaders have reiterated time and time again what happened on the 7th of October cannot happen again. Call it revitalized, call it rejuvenated, come up with another word. How do you convince the Israeli public that the new PA is somebody, an entity that can be trusted?
By leadership, you know. The basic function of leadership is not to be elected, but to lead. That's in the word itself. The Israeli public has been fed a whole bunch of lies and delusions, and it's time that someone spoke the truth to them. By the way, what you just said is not technically right. The PA has not given huge support to what happened October 7th. It hasn't even given small support to what happened October 7th. What is true is Palestinian public opinion.
The public
Yes.
in Ramallah,
So let me ask you
the PA
this.
sentiment is overwhelmingly in support of Hamas right now. No doubt about it.
Yes, that's true. And when a given public has a perspective upon yourself that is so toxic and twisted and hostile, do you want them to be within your political entity or without? Is it better to mix with the Palestinians or continue to strive to have some kind of separation from the Palestinians? I understand it sounds tougher to say occupy them, but in this case, toughness is also idiocy.
Two processes will take place simultaneously in parallel in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority will revitalize itself, will go through a very significant process of reforms, and in the Gaza Strip, a sort of regional task force will take responsibility over the territory and the population and for the training and the education of local administration that will be connected to the Palestinian Authority. But the Palestinian Authority will be able to return as such to the Gaza Strip only after reaching to the standards that were stated by President Biden about the idea of revitalized Palestinian Authority, not in the current conditions of situation.
Dan, your response.
Well, I do agree. I would just note that if Israel's goal is this regional umbrella that includes Saudi Arabia and all the rest of it, then making nice with the Americans and agreeing to have the PA be part of the day after plan to some degree probably go hand in hand. And an occupation of Gaza does not. And therefore, I suspect that it'll be some mix of all this, some mix where, at least on the surface, it'll be the PA, but a joint multinational task force operating in concert with Israel, some version of a military occupation with the PA as a civilian arm of it might probably be the optimal thing. We're not looking at a perfect solution. We're looking at a patchwork as I said, interregnum. And I think the professor's ideas are correct. It's a question of the timing, which comes first. But more or less, we see the direction, and I can only hope that the government and the Prime Minister finally wake up and understand that discussing a day after plan, as we're doing here in the studio, is something that has to happen and cannot be forever forestalled for fear of the extreme right in the government.
With regard to Rafah, I think that the mission must be accomplished there. It doesn't mean that it must be done now, and it doesn't mean that it must be done in the same modus operandi that we knew in Gaza or in Khan Yunis. I think that it will be done in a much more surgical manner. And if you ask me, I think that the more crucial issue than the 4 battalions in Rafah is the Philadelphia corridor. And there, I think that Israel can reach to understandings with Egypt, with the American facilitation, because if we will not be able to shut down the tunnels beneath Philadelphia corridor, then the Gaza Strip will be refeeded in a very short period of time with ammunition, people,
Right.
equipment, money, whatever you want.
Dan, I've got 30 seconds for your response.
Look, I hate to sound like a warmonger, but I don't think that surgical operations are going to take care of Hamas and Rafah. I think there's probably no avoiding, at some point, not immediately, but at some point going in there and finishing the job. There's no alternative, otherwise Hamas will declare a victory narrative.